There are kind of four main ways to sew a nice corner for this style of bag. And the first way is very, very simply to sew basically to the end of the first seam. And you probably don't want to run all the way off the fabric, but just as close as you care to get. Stop, raise your foot, take your thread out, cut your thread, and then place your corner back in the machine at the correct seam allowance. And you can actually start the seam kind of anywhere you want as long as it's not past the previous line of stitching, which I hope you can see all right. So that's method one. For method number two, I've actually marked the seam line with this lovely blue mark. This is a pin that I know I can take out with a little bit of water. So I'm just going to stitch right up to that. And at the end, I'll just turn my wheel instead of using the foot pedal. And then when my needle hits that center point, I'm going to make sure the needle's in the fabric, lift the foot, rotate the fabric, lower the foot, and then I'm ready to stitch on. That's called a pivot. So when someone talks about pivoting at the corner, that's what they're talking about. The third way is I kind of call by eyeball. So I'm just going to stitch up to where I think is about 1/2 inch away from the end here. And that looks pretty good. The same thing, needle down, foot up, turn. And then what I'm looking for is where does this edge fall against my marks here. You can see it's actually a little farther away from 4 than I want it to be, so I'm going to actually turn back. I'm going to move the machine back by 1 stitch. Well, I thought it was. Come on. There we go. And most machines some machines have a slightly different way of going backwards than others, so you have to kind of watch that. So now I'm much, much closer. There's my edge and there's my 4 line, which is where I want to be. Lower the foot again, and ready to stitch. Couple notes, and you can see this is actually going to be the 4th method, which is using a mark on the bed of the machine. But you'll also see that my cutting wasn't completely precise here. I could choose to trim this off, or I'm just kind of going to leave it, but just so you know, I'm aiming for the top edge to be the one that's the right distance from the needle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch right up to, I placed a piece of tape about 1/2 inch from where the needle is, so then I know when I can see the whole piece of tape that I'm about 1/2 inch. So then I can pivot. You can see it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Ready to keep stitching. Alright, and when you're ready to box your corners, which we'll discuss getting ready in class, but there are 4 different ways to do that. The first one is to sew on a marked seam line. So what I've done is I've marked this line with the blue marker, which I think you can see if I do that. So I'm just going to stitch right along this line, and in this case I am going to back stitch a little bit at the beginning of the seam just to make sure I get all the way to the back. Okay, and then I'm going to stitch. Be very careful, never ever stitch over a pin. And in fact, as I get close to the pin area, I'm going to take that pin out. There's my pin, I'm going to take it out. And a back stitch at the end of this corner too, or this seam. The second way to mark your seam line is to basically place pins along the entire seam line. Now again, once I have the foot down, I'm going to remove my closest pin so that I'm not in any danger of sewing over pins, and I'm going to backstitch until I get back to the very beginning of the fabric. Okay, and now I'm ready. I'm going to stitch forward until I come near the end of this pin, and I'm going to take it out. Continue again. Once again, as soon as I even get close to the end, I'm going to pull that pin out. And you may not be able to see this, but I can actually see where the pin was, so that can help you keep a straight line. Get close to the end, and again, right up to the end, and then I'm going to backstitch a couple of stitches to hold it. The third main method for maintaining a nice straight line across here is to put a piece of tape along your seam line. It doesn't really matter what kind of tape. We're not going to be stitching through the tape, we're just stitching next to it. And I think if I shield the light a little bit, you might be able to see it better. I think you can see that maybe off. Yeah, okay, there's my tape. You know what, I can't turn it off if the whole machine won't run. But let's go back a couple stitches. And one thing you may notice, in order not to get in the way of the tape, I've moved this pin really close to the outer edge, which actually means I can leave it in position as I'm sewing. This last method is the one that's used quite a lot when you're kind of more used to sewing. But basically you start by kind of taking your top thread and pulling it back so you have a little extra top thread. And then I've got it marked with just two little pins, one little pin at the beginning of the seam and one at the end, so that I know where to start. So here I am ready to start. I'm going to lower the foot, take the pin out, do my couple stitches back, and then what I'm going to do with the needle down in the fabric and the foot down, I'm going to lift the foot and bring that extra top thread toward me up to the other pin on the end of the piece I'm sewing, and then I'm going to wrap. I can actually gently kind of wrap that around, so then I have a straight line that the thread is showing me that I can then stitch across. Again, once I get close to this pin, I'm going to take it out. I got a little too close, so it's a little hard for me to reach in there. So again, with the needle down, I'm going to lift the foot, take the pin out. And if this starts getting a little loose, I can just kind of tug on it gently to bring it back into a straight line. Again, when I get a little close, I'm going to take it out and finish. Now sometimes when you do this, you will sew right over the thread enough to actually attach it to the piece. It's not a big deal. You just trim off any bits that are loose and go on with your sewing.